is the lecture on the fundamentals of supply and demand, and why understanding supply and demand matters to you. And the reading to the end of the page, it matters to you because you buy things, and the price you pay for the things that you buy is set by how supply and demand work. So the more you understand supply and demand and how those two things work and how they interact, that means you know why things cost what they cost. And so that is just going to be a very basic introduction to supply and demand. So the law of demand is the desire, willingness, and ability to buy a good or service. In other words, it is a consumer-oriented, consumer perspective of the purchasing process. So when we talk about demand, we're talking about it from the perspective of the consumer. What does the consumer want? What does the consumer have the ability to buy? Those two parts of the definition are very important. I may want a beachfront house, in South Florida, but I'm also a public school teacher in Little Rock. The ability for me to buy a beachfront house on the southern coast of Florida is nil. So that's not part of the demand, right? When people talk about demand for beach houses in South Florida, they are not factoring in Adam Kirby and his family as a potential buyer of beachfront property in South Florida, because we do not have the ability to buy that. So it's really important that you take both parts of that definition when you think about what demand is. Desire, willingness, and more importantly, the ability to buy it. So this is a demand schedule. This is how we map out what a demand looks like. And so on the left, you see what's known as the demand table. And you will notice the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. And if you remember, this is about consumers. That makes a lot of sense. If I have to spend $15 to buy one donut, then I'm probably not going to buy many donuts, if any, right? I'm not going to buy any donut for $15. But, if I can, get another number, and donuts may be a bad example, but if I can get 7 of a thing for $3, then I'm going to get 7 of that thing, right? We are always looking for deals. That is inherent into who we are. And so the individual consumer is always going to spend, if they can spend less money and get more stuff, they're going to do it, right? If I can go to the used record store and buy, 10 records for $60, then I'm going to go to the used record store and buy 10 records for $60. But if I have to go to the new record store and only buy 2 records for $60, then you can see that we all have that. That makes a lot of sense. And if you take the table here and graph it out, that's why it is a downward sloping graph, or downward sloping line. And this downward sloping line kind of goes from high price to high quantity. So it slopes downward. The reason it slopes downward is due to something known as the principle of diminishing marginal utility. And that just makes a lot of sense if you think about just what those words mean. Over time, things lose their usefulness for you. The cartoon here at the bottom is really good for this. I mean, if you're really hungry and craving pizza, that first slice of pizza is really good. But after you've had 9 slices of pizza, you're not getting the same utility from that slice of pizza, right? The diminishing marginal utility is part of this understanding of demand, because after a while, people are not going to demand that thing, right? So if you're a pizza place, you kind of take that into account. And so your large pizza is going to be what the owners of that pizza place believe will fulfill a person's utility or person's utility, right? They design the thing. People design the things that they sell to us so that um, you get just enough of said thing before you have to go back and get more of it. So to make a buying decision, we consider whether the satisfaction we expect to gain is worth the money we must give up. So there are certain things where we're going to be like, I'm going to get a lot of satisfaction for that, so I'm going to buy that, and that satisfaction is worth the money that I'm giving up for that. And so this is a very important principle in understanding demand and how consumers think about what they buy. Um, we want some kind of satisfaction for what we are buying. So there are 5 things that shift the demand curve, that downward sloping line. There are 5 things, and there's a silly acronym for it. It's called BITER, BITER, but it's an acronym. And these 5 things, when they are impacted or when these things happen, the demand curve can move, right? So if the number of buyers changes, right? If the number of people who want to buy pizza increases, well, that's going to change the demand for pizza. If the number of people buying pizza in a certain city increases by 100 people, then that's going to need to be more pizza places opening up. And the pizza places that are open are going to have to increase the amount of pizza that they make, right? Because the demand for pizza is going to increase. If income changes and a consumer's income changes, so I used the example at the beginning of this about me buying a beachfront house in South Florida. Well, if I got a 6-figure raise, right, and I'm making high 6 figures, then maybe all of a sudden I am in the market for a South Florida beach house, right? So if your income changes, then the demand for what you can get also changes. And the reverse of that is true. If I lose my job, then there is the reverse of that. What I buy will, what I demand will be lessened. Your taste change, and that is very true. I mean, what I prefer now is a 47-year-old person is not at all what I preferred when I was 27. Um, and so demand changes based on your preference, what you want. And as I was talking to someone this morning about preferences, I mean, styles change. And so, 15 years ago, maybe skinny jeans are in, and now skinny jeans not so much in. So, you know, again, people who are supplying things have to take these things into account. Expectations, well, again, expectations kind of tie into not just what your future income may be, but a pandemic is about to hit and we're about to be on lockdown for a year. That's going to change what we buy, right? That's going to change how we engage in the economic system. And so expectations, we're going to have a child, we're have an elderly family member who's sick. All of these sorts of things can impact demand. And then finally, a concept known as related goods, complements and substitutes, which I'm going to talk more specifically about in the next slide. But these 5 things shift the demand curve. They make the demand curve move either up or down depending on what's happening within these ideas. So I said I'll talk about substitute and complementary goods. And so here is a slide on that to kind of talk about substitute and complementary goods. A substitute good is a substitute that can be used in place of another. Okay, so Coke and Pepsi, right? You may have your preference that Coke is better or Pepsi is better, but in terms of what they are, they're the same thing. And so the price of Coke, say it's $2, the price of Pepsi is $2. And if the price of Pepsi goes up to $3, Coke is going to follow suit and go to $3, right? Because they're substitute goods and they're going to stay priced at the same thing. A complementary good, on the other hand, would be like peanut butter and jelly, okay, bacon and eggs, cereal and milk. These things complement each other, and they have an inverse relationship. So if the price of peanut butter goes up, the price of jelly is going to come down, because people who make jelly are like, well, if peanut butter is $5 a bottle, and we go up to $5 a bottle, they ain't buying jelly, right? I mean, you're gonna have to buy one. You're gonna buy peanut butter. You want to buy jelly, but you don't want to spend, say, more than $8 on it. So jelly's gonna have to stay at $3 because peanut butter's moved up to 5. Because if jelly moves up to 5, then people aren't buying it. So complementary goods have to kind of work in concert to offset each other's prices. So that is complementary and substitute goods. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of demand. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about supply. Supply is from the producer's point of view. So if demand is always about consumers, supply is always about the people who produce and sell the thing. And so we're looking at supply, and they're wanting to sell pizzas. They're going to look at what the demand for pizzas is in that community and how to best do that. And then they're going to actually have to work through the process of knowing how much pizza they need to sell. This is a supply scheduling graph. On the left, you see the supply. The lower the number, the lower the price, the lower the quantity supply. Because from a producer standpoint, it's going to cost me money to make a thing. It costs me $2 to make a pizza. Well, I don't want to sell a pizza for $2 if it costs me $2 to make a pizza. That's ridiculous, right? I want to sell a pizza for $8. So if I sell a pizza for $8, I could probably sell, I can make 9 pizzas and I could do well. And you can see that the supply line goes from low to high. So demand is coming down and supply is doing this. So if you were to overlay demand, you would see an X on the screen. And so that's how they interact. The law of supply, the reason the supply curve slopes up is due to cost and profit. I've got to purchase resources. I've got to purchase dough. I've got to cheese, tomato sauce, toppings. I've got to pay for a pizza oven. So all of these things I've got to invest in. So when I sell my pizza, when I sell my product, I've got to pay for those things plus make a profit. So I'm incurring cost. So as I incur that cost, I'm keeping in mind that, to pay off all of my costs that I've incurred, that's going to cost $2. So I'm going to have to sell pizzas for $8, right? So that's really all this law of supply says, is that the producer wants to cover their cost. Again, there's a silly little acronym that impacts supply, and it's Stoner, and now you can giggle all you want, but it just is what it is. I didn't come up with these. So things that impact the supply side of the curve are subsidies and taxes. So government subsidies may encourage production by giving financial incentives to grow more corn, or they may discourage production, right? And if that's the case, then that obviously impacts supply. So if the government wants to discourage corn production, then the supply of corn is going to become limited, right? And that's going to impact various items that consumers then would buy. Technology is another thing that, if it changes, can improve production. If you can manufacture cars basically by having a bunch of robots do it, well, robots can work 24 hours a day. Robots don't need to be paid. Robots can then improve production because it becomes cheaper. You don't have to pay 1,000 auto workers, um, you know, $20 an hour to build your cars. You can get robots to do it. Other goods, so businesses have to consider the price of other goods they could be producing. So again, thinking again about how you, as a business, I mean, maybe if I'm selling pizza and I'm not doing very well selling pizzas, maybe that's because there are too many pizza places in the market, and I need to um, maybe sell cheeseburgers instead, which kind of leads into the next one, number of sellers. Like how many people are in the market. Suppliers always have to pay attention to how many people are in the market because they may need to sell other goods if there are too many people in the market. Expectations, again, this is kind of similar to the one with consumers. If I'm a producer, I need to take into account economic conditions. Um, if I was producing something during the economic collapse of 2008, 2009, that those were pretty tough economic conditions, or if I'm a producer here in the pandemic, those are pretty tough conditions, and that's going to impact the way I price things. And so having those expectations and being aware of that. And then finally, that also lends into resource costs. So what's the cost to purchase things? And again, things like subsidies, things like pandemics, uh, economic trashes can all impact the supply chain. And so my resource cost is always in flux. It's always something that I'm having to pay attention to. So I want to just show this graph, and I think it would be useful for you to, I think it would be useful for you to probably take a picture of this or save this slide. This slide in particular is a good cheat slide. It's a good slide to just have because it shows very clearly on the left-hand side, if this thing happens, if the cost of resources falls, what does that do to producers? They produce less, but because they're producing less, the amount of the supply will go up, and so the supply curve will shift this way. And so it just is really helpful to kind of show how the demand and supply interact when one of these things on the left happens. So it's good. I would certainly keep this handy. So, and then you have on the bottom of this, you can see an actual supply and demand curve. And just to remind you, the demand curve is sloping down, the supply curve is sloping up. And what you see is here at the top of that, it's created an X at the top in this sort of V shape here is what's known as a surplus. And on the bottom of that X is what's known as a shortage. And so you see a surplus is the amount by which the quantity supplied is higher than that of the quantity demanded. So, anything that kind of, if you were to like plot a point in the top of that X where that word surplus is, if you were to plot an X in there somewhere, that would lead to a surplus of stuff. If you were talking about pizza, that would lead to a surplus of pizzas. If you put a point there right under the P there in surplus, that would be a surplus of pizza. You got more pizza than is being demanded. But now if you put a dot over, say, the O down at shortage, if you put a dot down there, then you'd have a shortage. You wouldn't have enough pizza. So that's kind of how it works. Looking at a surplus and shortage, it's kind of just important to know that surplus would be at the top of the X and the V there, and the shortage would be on the bottom of the X. Obviously, the goal is to find market equilibrium, which is where the demand and supply meet in the middle, that perfect spot where you find no shortages and no surpluses. You find the actual price that consumers are happy paying and producers are making a profit. It's in that point where you have market equilibrium. The market is in balance when you find that point. And what's, to think about that is to think, how can producers and consumers find that spot, and often finding that spot is very difficult, and you may find it with one thing, but you may lose it in another thing. So trying to maintain market equilibrium prices for everything that is being sold is going to be darn near impossible. So you try to find, if you're producers, you're trying to find market equilibrium prices in the best way you can, and trying to find it for as many goods as you can. So that is my lecture on supply and demand. There is a quick little assignment on this, and it is very simple, but you will need to reference this PowerPoint for that. And also, don't forget there's the optional assignment, which is optional. If you would like to do that, that is also posted in the folder entitled Optional Assignment. And so if you have any questions, as always, please let me know through email, and I will get back to you when I can. Have a good week.